anticipate that this is a webinar of an hour, and we will be also live streaming. So if anyone has any Zoom issue, they can just visit the CPC website and the event page, and that will be streamed live. Today I also want to remember, actually there are a few cohorts of SMEs that have joined recently the AMI Simulate Accelerator, where CPC is involved, and they are looking at their quality challenge, so this is very relevant for them. Just for ice breaking and also waiting a couple of extra colleagues, I will run a poll just for awareness in terms of who you are, which area you are coming. Sorry, Nick, you have the poll available? I cannot find the poll here. Okay. So you can provide your answer to this poll, so we will know the distribution of attendees. And we will get some results shortly. Okay, that's good, because not everyone has attended already. So this is the first opportunity you had. We are fairly rich in SME startup, which is also probably driven by the AMI Accelerator I mentioned before. And so thank you for joining again. This is the webinar, Understanding and Improving Air Quality, Learning from Recent Research and Startup. Today we will have a set of 4 speakers, including myself, Eloise, Dr. Eloise Marais, Associate Professor in Physical Geography at UCLA, my colleague Bob on Market and Intelligence Team Lead, and Professor Zaili Young from the Faculty of Engineering and Technology at Liverpool University. You will have, we will have 50 minutes of presentations from the 4 speakers, and there will be 10 minutes or as much as possible questions. About the questions, you can use the QA button throughout the whole webinar, so you can provide and ask your questions, and my colleagues will combine them in a form that can be answered at the end in the 10 minutes. And so I think we are almost out there, 5 minutes. So so I can start my presentation firstly saying that this webinar is actually designed to start a bit of better understanding in terms of how their quality can improve, what are the problems behind it, but also since we are part of this session, Research in Residence program funded by EPSRC, 2 researchers and scientists will present their own research, as well as the findings from SMEs and startups we have been helping. About air quality, I have to say that actually it's not, we know everyone that is not that easy problem, and there are many areas. It's a multi-factor element that has caused issues over time, and our ambition is actually to have more cleaner and smarter and sustainable cities in the future. And every single part of this I call innovation area, but are area of actions we can all intervene, will play a big role in the future. This seminar is also focusing on mobility, and as Catapult, we really want to support the transition across the UK, both in terms of net zero greenhouse gas emissions in different sectors, not just transport, but also the clean mobility pathway. And that needs definitely a lot of help also from SMEs, so different markets, different opportunities, and both from academia and SME, we understand there are a lot of ideas and that would be a very good opportunity to test demonstrator in the future. If we consider the clean mobility, why is important? Definitely, there is a lot of push in decarbonization, especially from government, DFT, a lot of organizations at different levels. And it has been estimated already a few years ago that this is a market potentially of 450 billion. But I'm sure today the same analysis will tell us quite a lot more. And clean mobility is not just one area, as I said. We've been working quite a lot as a community in terms of reducing emissions, acting on alternative power supply, zero emission vehicles. But especially during the last few months, we have really understood that it's not just that element. And we can do quite a lot, probably by focusing also on integrated transport, designing better systems more close to people needs. And also, if that is possible, that will make probably easier for displacing demand and behavioral changes. That we have been forced probably more or less everyone to do different lifestyle, different actions, trips, and movements during the few months before. Another important element that I want to address is the key metrics. I think all of the actions and the strategies we will do in terms of air quality and clean mobility should be assessed by different factors, not just air quality, not just carbon intensity, but also people exposure, well-being, and the life cycle assessment, which is should play a big role in terms of sustainability, in terms of short, medium, and long term of all we do around clean mobility and decarbonization. Just to be a bit more provocative, also thinking about the wider problem and how we can address in the future. I think one key picture I've seen on the web that tells a lot in terms of how we can act today, but also in the future, is how WHO guidelines and EU limits, or the limits we are implementing in air quality today, they have some similarity, especially in NO2, but there are several differences in other pollutants. In particular, if we look at PM, and we assume to have the WHO guidelines as a reference, we will see suddenly that UK is not just about nitrogen dioxide and reducing pollution in terms of NO2, which are the majority of the air quality management area today, but also PM it will play a big factor. And especially recently in terms of deaths, not just from history, like I put there some reference, there has been some evidence also that higher quality, poor level of air quality, especially for PM, are actually driving higher level of death rate for COVID or other disease. Another element that I want to address is also how much we can really do in the future, taking some knowledge from what happened recently. And that opened also a few questions. A simple example that actually I listened to someone saying last week that actually looking at the data from April, where the lockdown has caused more or less a reduction of everything in terms of trips, traffic, movements, that has reduced by this graph, approximately about 75%. And at the same time, we had from the government and the National Office for National Statistics, the first result from April, GDP, and that was 20%. However, that clearly says something to us and pose a few questions. Actually, how much transport does we need, our economy need to run at a similar level as pre-lockdown? Because if we have 75% less traffic and we are actually minus 20% economy, that means actually we can do a lot of the economy without running all the traffic we had before the lockdown. So since we are starting to talk about new normal, I think remote working, online shopping, and local trips will be prevailing, or at least in the short term, but that could be a good excuse for trying new strategies and policies. But that will also create some other problems or shifting the problems. Just today, I've seen a news looking at some recent LA data analysis, and there was place for NO2 has been identified as a section of the A35, passing through the village in the West Dorset with almost 100 micrograms per cubic meter. And that was the highest level in the country, which actually reinforced the point that probably in the future we will have a more air quality hotspot on local, suburban, and town hotspot. And that will make also in terms of reduced need to travel, but more online shopping, shift from private to delivery fleet, which different consequences in terms of air quality and emission production, as well as shifting from transport to other sectors as we move more locally, or we tend to stay at home longer. We may cook more, need more eating in the winter, and that shift basically the emissions across sectors. And again, something I've been thinking is a clean air zone is quite recent, but also has been designed for the pre-COVID. In the new normal, with all this potential shift, is that actually going to be exactly fitting for the purpose, or should be considered different levels according to where the hotspot may be happening and the size of that hotspot? And finally, I wanted to consider some in terms of long-term as well as short and medium-term actions. If we look at the electric vehicle market and the projection in terms of penetration, the best I could find recent projection, we are talking about maximum 26%, and that is driven by mainly decarbonization as well as air pollution in cities. But in order to achieve the targets that we have all seen from the government, from high level, United Nations even, these best scenarios tell us that possibly we can get up to 30% in the best scenario, electric vehicles. At the same time, so far, we've been told that we can grow and we can have more better economy if we have more vehicle around, more movements, and so on. And all the prediction says that probably we will get about 40% extra vehicle in the next 20 years, which overall seems to be not the solution, but actually one element of, or one approach to the solution. So we need to do quite a lot more than just looking at the electric vehicle. And I think in terms of areas that we can all think about, they can be cross correlated, or can sometimes work in silos most of the time. But actually our role in the Catapult is actually to make these all working together. And the last thing I want to mention in this context is actually that probably indoor and outdoor air quality will be more and more important, this trade-off. And in particular indoor, we spend 90% of our time indoor, and more now than ever after the first pandemic. We will be really careful about what indoor air quality we will have and how we treat the quality of the air. And that's my presentation. Thank you for listening. Now I will move to the next speaker, Dr. Eloise Marais. I can go. Eloise?
Yep, I'm ready. As long as you can hear me, that's fine. Yeah, you can progress to the next slide, please. Thanks, Fabio. Yeah, so I'm going to provide a perspective on how we can potentially monitor air quality, or at least improve the current approach with which we're monitoring air quality, specifically in cities, in order to make effective policies that work. We want to also be able to understand how air pollution has evolved in cities, what the sources are that contribute to this air pollution, what the effect is of implementing policies on air quality throughout the city. And here the focus is on using measurements that are made on instruments that are based in space. If you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So just to give you some context, the current method that's used to monitor air pollution makes use of surface monitors where these are available. And so I've shown a best case scenario where we have local as well as national monitoring networks across London, with some notable gaps, in particular in the southeast. And this is for monitoring NO2. So we have much more widespread monitoring of NO2 than any other air pollutants for London. And so as soon as we move away from London and look at other cities in the UK, this monitoring network starts to become more and more sparse. We also use information from models to fill in monitoring gaps. And so these models will use information that come from an emission inventory that's put together for the UK. Many countries in the world don't have this information readily available, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to put together this emission inventory. And then it's run through a model which at high spatial resolution won't include all of the detailed and very complex chemistry that takes place that leads to the formation of these air pollutants that Fabio was talking about, like NO2 and PM2.5. And I'm certainly not saying that we should dispel these tools that we're using currently, but there is an opportunity to use satellite observations to further augment this, to provide the additional evidence that we need to be able to develop effective policies. And so what I'm showing alongside the monitoring network that's available for London is satellite observations of NO2. I'll take you through a little bit about the nuances of satellite observations, but the units might seem unusual. When we think about air pollutants, we typically think about air concentrations of micrograms per meter cubed. The satellite tells us about the number of molecules of NO2 through the atmosphere, all the way from the surface of the Earth right up to the satellite, but most of the NO2 is concentrated in the surface, the part of the atmosphere that we are exposed to. And so this is just to orient you, but you can see in this figure, the high concentrations are heavily located over London and as well as over the Drax power plant. And then there are lower concentrations as you move further away from the cities into less populated areas. Next slide. Oh, I think you might have skipped. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. This shows the actual extent of these satellite observations. They're global, so we can scale up looking at changes in air pollution in cities to the whole world. And you can see the notable features. North China has high concentrations of NO2 associated with anthropogenic activity. South Africa has a hotspot associated with very, very energy intensive industry, as well as power plants and converting coal to liquid fuel. And then in Central Africa, there's burning of biomass, so widespread burning of vegetation leading to the production of NOx. And you can even look at ship tracks. So I can get lost in an image like this because it tells us so much about air pollution throughout the world. Next slide, please. The other important thing about satellite observations is that they don't just provide measurements of one pollutant, they provide measurements of multiple pollutants. And my intention here is not to take you through a chemistry lesson. This is just to highlight the pollutants that can be seen from space with these little icons showing satellites. So we can see things like SO2 that for the UK come from, for example, burning of coal, but other energy intensive industries. We can see an oxidation product of non-methane volatile organic compounds. Well, non-methane volatile organic compounds are precursors for the formation of the air pollutants ozone and PM2.5. And we have very few to no measurements of NMVOCs, even in the UK, where we have relatively more than other parts of the world. We have measurements of NO2, as I've shown already, and then of ammonia, which is incredibly interesting, not directly regulated, and comes predominantly from agriculture. And then, of course, we can see not PM2.5 directly, but we can see information that tells us about how PM2.5 is varying in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. The other important thing about satellite observations is that they have a really long and well-sustained record. There's lots of acronyms here, and I don't mean to burden you with these. These are just the names that are given to the different instruments that are in space. And I've highlighted the three that I make substantive use of to better understand changes in air pollution in cities. These include the Ozone Monitoring Instrument, or OMI, the Infrared Atmospheric Sounding Interferometer, EASI, and then the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer, or MODIS. And they tell us about different things about the atmosphere. OMI tells us about gas phase compounds, as does EASI, and then MODIS tells us about PM2.5. And some of these have been in space for more than 10 years. So you could start to build a historical record about how air pollution has changed in cities to evaluate how policies have been effective at reducing air pollution or ineffective, and as well as looking at how rapid development in cities in the absence of air quality policies leads to substantial and rapid degradation of air quality. Next slide, please. One issue that I have to highlight is that these satellite observations are at coarse spatial resolution. And so this just shows visually the extent of a single pixel or data point from these satellite observations relative to the size of London. So for something like the OMI instrument, we only get about 4 or 5 pixels in London. For the MODIS instrument, we see a lot more, but it's still at 3 kilometer resolution. So I'm not advocating for using these to understand postal code levels of air pollution. What I'm advocating for is the ability to use these to monitor citywide concentrations of air pollution every single month of the year for more than a decade, to understand how air pollution has evolved in a city like London. Next slide, please. The spatial resolution of these instruments is improving. So this just shows the time record of the sort of next satellites that are going to be launched into space, demonstrating that the record is also sustained. And we're starting to get information that's getting us to less than 5 kilometers, less than 1 kilometer spatial resolution, to get down to finer scale information to essentially extend the utility of satellite observations in understanding the spatial variability of air pollution in cities. Next slide, please. I've mentioned this already, I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just to highlight how these observations are obtained. The sun is the light source. The instrument gives us spectra across a range of wavelengths. We then fit these spectra to get concentrations of air pollutants. But this does extend to the whole atmosphere. So we get the number of molecules of NO2 throughout the whole atmosphere. But what's important to acknowledge is that most of that NO2 is in the polluted layer in the atmosphere. So any variability that we see in the satellite observations reflects variability in this polluted layer. So these satellite observations provide us with really effective constraints on changes in air pollution in cities, the kind of air pollution that we're concerned about, that we breathe in or that affect crops and vegetation and other resources and ecosystem services. Next slide, please. Okay, this is kind of fallen apart. I see the icons collapsed in this one. So what this was supposed to show is that the cross indicates that in terms of quality assurance of these satellite observations, we've been able to perform this using surface observations that are available. So the little green boxes that you're seeing would have shown a tick mark showing that the quality assurance was approved and passed for NO2 and for ammonia, as well as aerosol optical depth or PM2.5. And then NMVOCs or non-methane volatile organic compounds. The icon that stayed behind was the big red cross, which is showing that SO2 didn't pass. So unfortunately, SO2 has a very, very poor detection. And so you can only really see SO2 sources that are really, really large. So this would be a few years ago, power plants in China and very, very intense volcanic emissions. But we can't see SO2 in cities in the UK. Next slide, please. And so this is just demonstrating how we effectively use this data. So we estimate monthly averages of NO2 and aerosol optical depth that I'm showing here as 2 examples in London and Birmingham for the UK, and then Delhi and Kanpur, 2 cities in India. We take these monthly averages, fit them to a time series, and then do a trend analysis on these to determine how the NO2 and PM2.5 have changed over time in these cities, and also whether the change is significant. What we find for NO2 is that the change has been about 2.5% per year in both London and Birmingham, demonstrating that the policies that are being implemented are effective. But if we apply something like this 2.5% per year decline to a very, very polluted site like Marylebone, it means that it would probably take about 30 to 40 years for that site to achieve compliance at these current rates. For something like air pollution in Delhi and Kanpur, both cities are developing rapidly. There's supposed to be air quality policies in Delhi, but using the satellite observations, we're not seeing that these are effective at reducing pollution levels. And so we're seeing the opposite in these cities. And for PM2.5, it's an increase of 2.5% per year for Delhi, 3.1% per year for Kanpur. Next slide, please. And this just summarizes the results, which shows that for London and Birmingham, air quality policies are effective, and so pollution is decreasing. For Delhi and Kanpur, the opposite is the case. With the exception of ammonia, in all cases, we don't have any direct controls on ammonia, and so there's no significant change in ammonia concentrations, indicating that we really do need to develop policies that target agricultural sources of ammonia to address high concentrations and the lack of significant change, where ammonia contributes to PM2.5 concentrations and substantially contributes in the UK. Next slide, please. I think I'm about to wrap up. Oh, do you mind skipping 4 slides ahead? I should probably wrap up at this stage. We've done additional analysis, which has looked at tropical megacities, so applying these satellite observations to locations of the world that are going to be experiencing rapid development. And so those are the slides that I would have shown, but these will be available, and you're welcome to email me if you have any questions about them. Just to acknowledge that in my research group, the person doing the data analysis is Kern, and this work has been submitted for peer review. And I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the presentation series. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Eloise. Now we will be moving to the next presentation. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Fabio, and hi, everyone. Great to have you on the webinar. Just a reminder before I jump in, if you have any questions that occur to you as you listen to the speakers, please use the Q&A function to write your question down, and we'll have some time at the end to cover off the questions. If you could go to the next slide, please, Fabio. Thanks for the previous speakers. So we've heard about how air quality fits within a wider system of challenges and how we are increasingly able to measure different aspects of air quality through satellite imaging. I'm going to discuss a project we are running alongside 2 other catapults, energy systems and satellite applications in Bengaluru, India, called Innovating for Clean Air. Go to the next slide, please. As we've already heard, air pollution isn't a simple issue. There are many types of pollutants and many sources of pollution. We're all familiar with, the usual suspects such as transport and industry, but even seemingly unconnected sectors like agriculture can be part of the problem. In Delhi, for example, the thick smog in the city worsens each October due to the crop burning in surrounding states. And ironically, they deferred the crop burning to October to correct another problem regarding sort of sanitation in the states as well. So it's an example of unintended consequences. Go to the next slide, please. So in general, air pollution is a big problem in India. It's very acute. You can read some of the stats on the slide here. I think the most striking one for me is the fact that air pollution causes around 1 million deaths in India annually. So that's a huge number. And as an example of the kind of chain of causation, we heard about the PM particles, so the particulate matter particles earlier. They aggravate respiratory conditions. And as Fabio mentioned as well, they've been implicated in higher death rates for COVID-19. So lots of kind of contributors to premature deaths and other health issues caused by air pollution. One of the slides that Eloise was showing earlier focused on the tropical megacities, and of which Bangalore is one, and it has a particularly problematic issue with air pollution, which has been getting worse progressively as the city's grown. So that's one of the reasons we decided to focus on that city for IFCA. If you could go to the next city, the next slide, please. The goals we have in the programme are 2 high-level goals. It's to kind of facilitate and develop impactful air quality interventions. And we're also in parallel to that, trying to enable the transition to electric vehicles, which is already Indian national government policy. So we're just trying to help along the way there. We've got a range of partners who are supporting us in the programme. So academic partners include the Indian Institute of Science, the Indian Institute for Information Technology, and we're also working with various NGOs and community groups. If you could go to the next slide, please. One key element of the air quality activities in the programme, focusing on those, is led by satellite applications Catapult. And that's actually interesting because it speaks to one of the challenges that Eloise mentioned earlier, which is the slightly low granularity to the data that satellite imaging is able to provide at the moment. So what the project's doing is integrating that satellite data with on-the-ground sensor data to provide a kind of finer grained quality and a picture of the air quality in the city itself. So that's being led by satellite applications. In terms of the CPC activities, we're focused on supporting SMEs, both Indian and British SMEs, in testing, demonstrating and refining air quality related solutions. We started by working with local stakeholders to make sure we were focused on relevant challenges. And then we ran a competitive open call process to select companies to support. We're planning to deploy the solutions in local communities in Bengaluru from September this year, obviously pandemic permitting. And the selected companies have developed solutions in a range of different areas. So I'll talk through a few of those now. If we go to the next slide, please. So a selection of our SMEs have solutions which help measure air quality across different pollutants and exposure patterns. So we have sensor providers that cover both indoor air quality, outdoor air quality, and another company that provides a personal exposure monitoring system. It's important to note, though, that we didn't just want to provide a more accurate measurement of what is already known to be a problem, but we also wanted to make interventions to try and improve the situation. So if you go to the next slide, please. So one of the ways that we're doing that is we're working in partnership with a local authority called the Department for Urban Land Transport. And with their support, we're pedestrianising a major street in central Bengaluru on Sundays for a few months. And then we'll be working with various of our partner sensor companies to measure and demonstrate the impact of this pedestrianisation on air quality. The long-term goal is to pedestrianise the streets permanently. At the same time as this, we'll also be using the space and the opportunity to demonstrate various electric and active mobility solutions. Again, making the point that they minimise pollution compared to traditional transport forms. Next slide, please. We'll also be supporting a startup called SORA to test and improve a personal exposure monitoring solution. This tracks the pollutants an individual is exposed to, builds up a pattern over time, and then makes customized suggestions on how the person can reduce the risk. So for example, they might improve the ventilation in their home, they might identify some furniture which is producing pollutants and change the furniture. Next slide, please. So on a similar note, we're also working with a company called Arbon Co, who provide indoor air quality monitoring and optimization solutions for offices. They fit out offices with a range of sensors and a control system which is used by facilities management to help address issues of air quality indoors. Next slide, please. So don't have time to discuss in detail all of the other interventions that we're supporting, but very briefly, they're around demonstrating and getting buy-in for alternatives to petrol or diesel vehicles. A couple of companies also are providing interesting solutions which literally break down pollutants into harmless components through photocatalytic reactions. So one does this by using fans and the other does this literally just by having paint, which is catalyzed by sunlight. If anyone is interested to hear more about any of the SMEs that we're supporting, then do drop me a line. I'm happy to connect to you afterwards. Next slide, please. So what next? That was a whirlwind tour of the project. Next steps are to launch the UK-India Green Business Portfolio. So that's a kind of showcase of all the companies that we're working with. And of course, launch the testbed itself to get the solutions up and running. The longer term goals is to support the SMEs on the project in scaling and driving adoption of their solutions. So the testbeds themselves will provide some user and technical testing to help them improve their solutions. Obviously, we'll be generating some good publicity through the program itself to help them market and sell their solutions. And we're also already finding some really nice connections and collaboration opportunities, both between academics and between startups and other companies between the UK and India. So that's a summary of the IFCA program. So thanks for your time. And as I say, happy to take questions at the end. We'll move on to the next.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so next speaker and last speaker will be Professor Zaili. Over to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Fabio, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to present my research in residence project collaborating with CPC. Next slide, please. The project is about the prioritizing vehicle cleanliness. So it's still kind of the measurement project, not directly measuring the pollution and emissions, but to show how clean a vehicle can be for better air quality. Next slide. It will start with some information regarding this research in residency project. Also send the credit to the colleagues from the CPC, and spend a few minutes on the key green performance indicator project. So that is mainly the key part of the PVC project. And the third item will be something relating to the data collection and the preliminary findings. And the whole project, the framework is demonstrated by a case study. And then it will be finished by the future work and the potential impact. Next slide, please. So as I indicated, I think the whole project is really to see how a vehicle is clean. And as Fabio already mentioned, apart from waiting for the electrified vehicles to replace all the existing fleet, there are other complementary solutions, such as using some incentives, at the same time get the customers to buy more clean vehicles. And this project mainly is to develop a single value indicator to tell basically the clients and customers which vehicle is cleaner than the others. Next slide, please. So it's really, when we talk about the aim, is motivated by some similar index from other sectors, such as Euro NCAP, such as the energy labels from our kitchen appliance. The current literature, when we do the literature search, we find out there are some sources indicating different levels of emissions and pollutants from different types of vehicles. But we haven't really found any framework that will be able to combine all different emissions and pollutants from the vehicles to form a single value that can clearly give an indication about the car's pollution level. Sorry, can we just go back to slides here? On top, forward one. Yeah. On top of that, we also noticed that in order to guide the buyer's choice, we also need to take into account some other factors from social science perspectives, such as the car's vehicle's performance, the cost, and also other incentives from the government. So there are certain steps in order to establish the framework, including the KGPI, including the selected vehicles, how to measure it. So from the right-hand side of the slides, we're seeing there are various factors and indicators that influence the vehicle's cleanliness. As I have explained, they are located at different levels of the hierarchy. So we developed this framework. The framework will enable us not only to analyze the emission damage to the human health or emission damage to the environment. It can provide us an overall picture. On top of that, if we really want just to focus on any specific indicator at the second layer or third layer of the hierarchy, we can really assign the zero weight to the other factors. So the hierarchy and the framework can help us or help different types of stakeholders to do different types of analysis. Next slide, please. In order to do that, first of all, we need to see to which extent our stakeholder groups think the importance of different indicators. So we carry out a wide range of survey in order to allocate different weights for different indicators. Here we receive a massive support from colleagues, CPC colleagues like Fabio himself, Nick Ward, and Burgoyne, so on and so forth. So big thanks to them. And if we look at the bottom part of the slide, we also divide the questionnaire survey into different classifications, like Greater London areas, Northwest, and also the family situation, the buyer situation, and the vehicle's age, in order to enrich some informative findings at a later stage. Next slide, please. So after the survey, we found out the result. So the result is, in fact, very interesting to ourselves as well. One of the aims is to see what are the different perspectives from different group of stakeholders. For instance, when we look at the vehicle's cleanliness or incentives from government perspectives, will our government policymakers really understand the demand from the buyers? The result tells us it may not be that consistent. If we look at the second and the third column in the table, from buyer's perspective, the most important factor is buyer cost, followed by the emission damage to the environment and the emission damage to the human health. If you look at the value there, these three factors, their total weight is over 60%. However, if you look at the fourth and fifth column, from government and technical bodies, their perception is different with the buyers. They still think that the buyer cost is the most important, but followed by the car performance. And if you look at the absolute value, the sum of the first two factors, the buyer cost and the car performance, already take up over 60%. So I think that this will give some insights for supporting the policy making. Next slide, please. And the second type of data we need to collect is about the individual car's performance. In order to measure their individual performance, we need to set or predefine the evaluation grade for each indicator. And the slides give us some examples with regards to the pollutants, including CO2, NOx, and FOX, and PM, so on and so forth. And all the grades are predefined with reference to the previous studies in the literature. Next slide, please. And then we have selected 6 vehicles as the first group of test vehicles for demonstrating the KGPI framework. And their values with against each indicator had been provided and collected. Next slide, please. So through this a new advanced technique called evidential reasoning and a software called intelligent decision support software, we have developed a new prototype PVC evaluation tool. From the slides, we can see from general public or buyer's perspective, which vehicle is the best in terms of their greenness or cleanliness. Obviously, from our first group of testing, the Nissan Leaf is the most clean vehicle available or among the 6 selected cars. Some of you may notice that apart from the red color, for some vehicles on top, there are some gray areas or gray colors. Those colors indicate the incomplete data. One of the reasons why we select the evidential reasoning as the supporting technique to do the analysis is this software and this method allow us to accommodate some subjective elements, the uncertainty in data. So although we not have the accurate input data, but we still be able to, using this method and software, to tackle the uncertainty, provide the ranking. And at the right-hand side corner is the ranking from the government and technical perspective. Because they selected small samples, the results is rather consistent. Next slide, please. But here, if you look at the different comparisons, again, the 6 vehicles are provided in the first column. The second and the third column provide us the ranking from the buyers and government perspective, and the fourth and the fifth provide us the comparative results between the Great London areas and Northwest areas. As I mentioned earlier, most of the results are quite similar to each other. However, if you look at the third vehicle, which is VW Passat, and the last sixth vehicle, Tesla Model X, long range, between the Greater London and Northwest area, their ranking are different, is reverse. When we go back to do the sensitivity analysis, we find out the most influential factor contributing to such a difference is the incentives, because in London areas, we know that there's a lot of incentives and a lot of also negative ones, like the penalties, the congestion charge, so on and so forth. So the Tesla Model X is better than the VW Passat. Next slide, please. In terms of next slide, because there are various different directions that we can further investigate based on the current findings. One of the major things we are preparing currently is for the vehicles data that we collected for those first group of testing vehicles. The data are largely referred to the manufacturing specifications or data from manufacturers. As we know that with time, vehicles' performance will be degraded, and different drivers' behavior will also contribute to different levels of emissions. So the slide shows us a result from another project. We have developed portable equipment that can attach to the vehicle to detect the emissions from the vehicle directly. And we have the relevant associated software to model the driver's behavior to show how their behavior will contribute to different levels of emissions. So in future, we certainly can incorporate more dynamic data into this evaluation software so that we will be able to know the vehicle A at age 5 and driving in the off-peak time by a very aggressive drivers, what will be the emission levels or cleanness of the vehicle. So that will provide some more dynamic insights for the emission contribution from particular vehicles to the air quality. Next slide, please. So the last slide basically is to see the future research and also the possible impact. As mentioned several times, the main impact that we're looking at is how to reduce the emission from existing combustion engine fleet in the next 20 years before 2040. And we also would like to, if possible, collaborating with, can we just go back, to the authorities, transport authorities, to see whether we will be able to create a green label to replace the current schemes, which is mainly focused on the CO2. We know that the road tax is based on the CO2 levels, but as you know, we came across 3 presentations already. There's a far more pollutants than the CO2 from the vehicles. So if we certainly can verify the rationale of this single value index, and that probably can help the public to increase their awareness and also provide certain scientific suggestions for the transport authorities to make more rational policies. And eventually we hope that will improve the well-being and the health of the city residents and make the city greener and more sustainable. And we are currently receiving 2 more EU projects. One is the European Research Council one, £2 million to support a project that is very relevant to this one, and it can certainly supplement what we are planning in the last slide that I presented. That's basically all from me. The last slide is my email, so any questions will be very welcome. Thank you, Fabio. It's back to you.
Thank you very much, Zaili. So can I invite Bob and Eloise back so we can start the question session? And sorry for the few slides, Zaili, they were automated. That's why they were going on. So I needed to come back all the time. So if we can.
Fabio, I've got a question for each of you, if that's okay, and we'll start off with a couple of those.
Great.
So first one for you is Roy Thompson asked you, or said 76% of Edinburgh voters rejected a road pricing scheme in 2006. any thoughts on how to best regain public approval when presenting the city's revised low emission zone scheme? And secondly, any kind of technical solutions that may help implement such a kind of low emission zone or monitoring hardware, that kind of stuff?
Well, I think on that, at that time, definitely there was not the same technology we have today. So my first thought would be, since we have more technology built in, both in terms of vehicles, because new vehicles are going to be more connected, but they are also the cleaner ones. So the trade-off here is how much first we can restrict some movements, but also allow people to move towards cleaner vehicle, which Zaili research was exactly on that direction. Something I see in the future more and more important is actually how we communicate the actions, but also to better understand for the people what is the benefit, because so far all these actions are mainly focusing on restriction and the bad thing. What we probably need to focus in the future is also the benefit and the gain in terms of better health, better quality, which of course is difficult to provide as a message, because people at the end of the day will see their pockets more than anything else. And that's why technology may help. We have recently run a project actually in Leeds where we were testing dynamic zoning and how that can be transferred to not just a connected vehicle, pure connected vehicle, but actually vehicles themselves can actually switch from, especially hybrid and less polluting vehicle, from zone to zone. But I think also we learn quite a lot from experience of other sort of scandals in terms of, we know vehicles can themselves change their emissions, and they can actually make better air quality by moving. In the sense we can reduce drastically the pollution emissions, even doing the same movement, the same trip. Why we cannot use that element with the technology built in, that we can actually ask certain vehicle in the future to run smoothly, and also people to run smoothly, because at the end of the day, driver behavior affect even up to 40% of the emissions, and that can be, if better managed and controlled, that could be a win-win for everyone. I hope I responded to this sort of difficult question.
Thank you. Next one is for Eloise. Have you seen a kind of spreading out of emissions from urban areas moving into more suburban and rural areas? And there's also a follow-up to this. Also, given the kind of low resolution of the satellite data, how easy is it to determine what the root cause of the particular problem is being caused from the air quality? Sorry, I said that really badly.
That's fine. I had a look at it while Bob was giving his talk. Yeah, so in terms of me personally observing a change in the emissions, or at least a spreading out in the emissions from the city to more residential areas or areas external to the city, I can't really say, but I can certainly speculate. There's definitely, in a relative sense, a sort of flattening out, the difference between air pollution in the city versus outside the city. Whether the actual absolute change is significant, I'm not sure. And the effects that would be contributing would be just a general decrease in driving altogether, a general decrease in commuting altogether, but also this sort of unintended consequence of fewer people taking public transport. And so more people are driving further from the city into the city. So there's a lot of factors to take into account. And I think to get a rough estimate of what the effect is, I would advocate for using things like activity data that's being collected by local governments, by city councils, by Google. They have a very nice resource of mobility data that you can look at to determine whether there is this sort of spreading out of emissions. And then I think the other question was about directly detecting changes in specific sources. So specifically with the satellite observations I use on their own, they wouldn't provide a constraint on very particular emissions and their contribution to the decline. There you would have to couple it with additional information like activity data, emission inventories, information from Internet of Things. You know, there's multiple data sources that can be used if those are available. In the absence of those, I would advocate for using a model, validating the model against things like the satellite observations, where the model can tell you the relative contribution of the different emission sources. Hopefully that answered the questions.
I'm sure we'll get a follow-up if there's any clarification needed. Bob, what's a question for you? What's the best way to join the revolution in air quality in India, or kind of helping our SMEs to deploy solutions in India?
Yeah, so I saw Jim put that question in. Yeah, drop me a line, Jim. The open call obviously closed for the Innovating for Clean Air programme a few months back. There's a possibility we might have some SMEs drop out given the current pandemic, so there might be a space that opens up. But in general, there are kind of regular initiatives both from the Indian government and the UK government in this area. So I'm sure this won't be the last opportunity. And even if it's not working as part of a grant-funded agreement, obviously we have lots of connections now to relevant organisations on the ground. So happy to connect you.
Brilliant. And Zaili, one for you. Have you looked at the kind of manufacturing process in terms of your key green performance indicators? Have you looked at the kind of the manufacture of the vehicle? I will also add actually what happens to the vehicle after it's no longer used or decommissioned or been kind of going into the scrap heap.
Yeah, I think that, you know, as there are two sets of data relating to this KGPI framework. The first one is the importance of each indicator, and we did try to contact various manufacturers during that research project, but we received only one, I should say, qualified response for configuring the importance from the manufacturer's perspective. Well, I think your question, my understanding is mainly focusing on the second set of data, which is about the vehicle's performance in terms of their emissions. That exactly, I think I also look at the Q&A window. Some audience also mentioning about the reliability of the data. It's a very, very good question. I think that this is exactly the reason why when I talk to yourself and Fabio, I think all of us understand we surely need to using some more advanced sensor technology to detect the dynamic data in terms of the vehicle emission, and then, you know, compare those data with the data produced by the manufacturers. I'm sure we will find something quite informative and interesting. And my gut feeling now is I think the data will be significant. I'm not sure whether that will be significant, but there will be some difference between the data published by the manufacturers and the data we tested with our own tools.
That's great, thank you. And then really one last question for comment from all our panelists, if you think so. This is from, I think it's Michael.
Yes, I saw that. I asked actually Michael if that was referring to air quality monitoring methods. I don't know if you can.
The question was, so what were your views about calibration and trusting of the data from different methods? I'm guessing that is kind of collecting data on air quality.
I'm happy to give a short comment on it.
Yeah, and I can follow.
I think we have to be particularly cautious about understanding the size of the biases that are introduced by low-cost sensors, by the instruments that we use that are on space-based sensors, because the risk of using poor quality data is that you develop poor quality solutions, and misdirected solutions cost a lot of money. So I definitely advocate for being incredibly cautious, ensuring that they've undergone careful scrutiny, careful validation before they're sort of deployed into the field and used to monitor air quality and come up with policies.
Yeah, something I may add is, I mean, definitely different methods, they have different accuracy, and there are few works, and we are involved in one of them, looking at how different from precision, reference, and low cost can change the way they monitor. They also are accurate over time. But at the end, what we are trying to do is actually moving from a unique point or few points within the city where we know very well what is happening, to the many points that may be related to hotspot, and that will require more and more monitoring, both for identifying or confirming the pollution hotspot and problems, but also to monitor the changes and the benefit of certain strategies. So monitoring, we need probably a combination of them, and some of them will be required to look at differences, not the absolute value, and others which will require constant precise monitoring to make sure we are not going above or below thresholds. I hope that will answer the second part.
Okay, any final comments from Bob or Zaili? If not, we may have to wrap up at this point.
I think I totally agree with Louis' comments regarding the validation of the data and the results. So we can't really just trust on a single source of data to draw a solid conclusion. Using my project as an example, it probably will have some commercial influence to different type of vehicles and manufacturers. So before we publish or make it publicly available, we definitely need to have different source of data to validate and verify our findings. By the way, I think that this project, the outcome has been submitted to a leading journal, peer-reviewed journal. Nowadays, it's subject to moderate or minor revision. So if there's any further explanation needed, I hope the paper can be published, and that will become much more self-explanatory, or my email is attached for further information. Thank you, Nick.
Bob, do you have a few words?
I know we're up against time, so I'll probably save my comments, but thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thanks to every speaker for contributing to that. Thanks also to the 28 still online, despite we are 3 minutes over. Just to conclude, I want to remember a few other events we are organizing in August, and that will be also backed up with the slides in an email following these events, and a few other information that will be useful for you. Thanks again to everyone for attending and speaking. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.